what do we mean by CSR is dead, long live CSR? Well, for some people, you might think about a prehistory of CSR. There's some people who would go back to the Vedic or the Vedic texts, which is what you see on the left. And in those texts, which go back over 4,000 years, there are references to the ethics of business. In particular, whether it's unethical to be charging interest on loans, the concept of usury. So you could go back 4,000 years, but perhaps that's a bit of a stretch. Others might point to the 1850s and the late 1800s. And why I put Macy's up there was because Macy's was apparently the first recorded instance of a philanthropic donation being part of a corporate program. And so Macy's was supporting, in the late 1800s, an orphanage, and this was part of their responsibility. And then you can go through to the great philanthropists of the late 1800s. We had Rockefeller, we had many others, Cadbury over here. And I'm not sure that Archie Carroll is the guy at the bottom would thank me for putting him on a prehistory slide. But for those who work in the academic space, he's probably the academic who most defined CSR. In 1978, I think it was, he came up with his pyramid of CSR and a definition that has really endured for a long time and people still quote it. So that's perhaps a prehistory. Next slide. I think it's important to look at the other side of it, which is the sustainability side. And here again, you can go back as far as you like to the Bushman paintings, where there's clear evidence as you get into their culture of a stewardship of nature approach, of respecting the spirits of those that they are hunting. But perhaps more recently, many would point to Elder Leopold Sand County Almanac, his American conservationist in the early 1900s. Many people, though, would point to Rachel Carterson's Silent Spring as the time that really we kicked off with the environmental or the sustainability movement. And then all the way through to the present day with Al Gore and his Inconvenient Truth. So we've got a long legacy here. Next slide, please. Clements. The way that I like to think of it is that we have seen this evolution since the 1970s. In the responsibility side, it was very much as shareholder focused. Then we had the famous article by Friedman, Milton Friedman, saying the business of business is business, or is to make a profit. And then philanthropy was quite strong in the 80s, which was also the sort of greed is good 80s. And so the idea was to make as much money as you could and then give some of it away. We did see the corporate governance movement of the early 90s with the Cadbury Code and the King Code in South Africa and various others, Turnbull and so on. And then I think the late 1900s, we started to see a lot more talk about stakeholders. With Ed Freeman's stakeholder theory, one of our people in the room, Maria Silampa, wrote a book called The Stakeholder Corporation. And then the shift, I think, in the early 2000s has been to talk more about accountability. And what does it mean? Not only for companies, but also for NGOs. And I think we're getting to the stage now where we're lifting it up a gear to talk about responsible competitiveness, which is, how does this affect the competitiveness of nations, whether companies are responsible? Next slide, please. I think there's been a similar sort of pattern of evolution on the environmental side, or the sustainability side, starting with the quality movement in the 70s. Then they brought on health and safety. Then they integrated environmental health and safety. Then the triple bottom line, John Elkington's idea of sustainability came in. And finally now I think we're talking far more about sustainable markets. We're talking about the clean tech boom. So again, I think it's gone up a gear to a much more systemic level. Next, please. Well, so what do we mean by CSR 2.0, by corporate sustainability and responsibility? At one level, it's changing the acronym. It's trying to bring these two streams together and saying that the battle of the labels, let's get over it, you know. Basically, if you look at what companies are putting out, for example, in their non-financial reports, they're talking about either corporate sustainability or corporate responsibility. So let's just stop bickering about the language, let's pull the two together, and still keep the acronym, because, hey, it's got a long legacy, and it slides off the tongue a bit easier than some of the long words. So that's at one level. But another way to look at it is to say, well, these are slightly different things. For me, you could say that sustainability is about where we want to get to. We want a sustainable society. We want a sustainable economy. Responsibility is about how we get there. So we want institutions that are responsible. This is the action side of the agenda. So you could think of it as like the two strands of DNA coming together and forming this new idea of CSR 2.0. If I were to summarize it, and I'm not going to say much more about it tonight, I have written elsewhere about it. It's about three principles for me. The first is connectedness. So this is the idea that you have to get into cross-sector partnerships. You have to be far more in tune with your stakeholders. It's about scalability, which is probably the area where we've most failed in terms of the old CSR. So yes, we've had fair trade, yes, we've had organic, but actually it's remained marginal. And so what we're looking for there is what I start to call the Walmart effect and the Tata effect. The Walmart effect, you know, you start to get scalability when Walmart says all our cotton will be organic, and when you know what sort of supply chain they've got around the world. Or they say that all their stores are going to go zero carbon. Then you start to generate scalability. The other sort of example would be, look at the Toyota Prius, a wonderful kind of example of new high technology. But is that another example of just a premium brand, like us going into the store and saying, yes, we can afford it, we'll buy the premium brand. And that ethical consumerism really only ever remains a tiny percentage. And it doesn't fundamentally change the scalability. Versus Tata, you know, who starts out in steel and then makes the Tata Nano. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but small car, you buy for $2,500. So the idea that everyone can afford mobility. Now there are other issues about whether we really want everyone driving a car, but the issue of scalability, I think, is one we have to really get to grips with, otherwise we'll always remain marginal. And finally, responsiveness. You know, are we going to continue to put out annual reports in paper that very few people read and are quite out of date by the time anybody does read them? Or are we going to go to a real online, real-time? You know, I don't want to know that somebody's polluted my air, you know, 2 years ago. I want to know what's happening this week. I want to know what they're doing, you know, about a crisis that's happening yesterday. So I think the idea of responsiveness is going to be a key element, a key principle. Next slide, please. Well, you can see I've spent too long in consulting and academia when I start to come up with double helix models. But really what we're referring to here is bringing together these two strands of responsibility on the one side and sustainability on the other side. And you can look at it as the four levels, if you like. So yes, we're aiming for economic sustainability, but we need financial responsibility to get there, as we are now seeing in the financial crisis, where we're just paying the price for financial irresponsibility. Yes, we need human sustainability, but we're only going to get there if we have labor responsibility down the supply chain, and so on. Social sustainability through community responsibility. And I think the environmental issue actually needs moral responsibility. I'm not sure we're going to solve it through eco-efficiency and through the business case. At some point, we're going to have to take a stand and say, this is a finite planet, we're going to have to make some trade-offs here. And climate change is the test case for us all.